Welcome to Hearts of Space. Not really. Hey there, it's your old pal Keith from wavetables.lol. That's wavetables.lol, home of KRC Mathwaves, my gigantic collection of single-cycle waveforms and wavetables for all sorts of modern synthesizers, and they are useful. And our friend Dawesome Myth, and I wanted to talk today about physical modeling with Dawesome Myth. Dawesome Myth, at its heart, despite the marketing materials about it, is in fact a physical modeling synthesizer. And I wanted to talk about physical modeling synthesis. This is probably going to be a pretty talky video, but we're also going to do some tutorial stuff. We're going to show how to use the various physical modeling components that are included in Myth. And this is an area that is not very well explored in the factory patches, which are sort of all over the place, which kind of surprises me, because we'll see toward the end of this video how physical modeling is really at the core of this instrument. So let's get started and let's talk about what is physical modeling. So physical modeling synthesis refers to a whole category of synthesis techniques where we are trying to emulate the properties of acoustic instruments, right? And physical modeling is in a way sort of a misnomer because we're not trying to model any particular instrument necessarily, but we're being inspired by the physics of how acoustic instruments operate, right? So one thing that is very common is to take an exciter, like let's say I've got a drumstick or a beater or a mallet, right? And I hit some object, it's going to make a tone, right? Depending. My coffee mug is not particularly resonant. Now, what we do in physical modeling synthesis is we use some sort of resonator and we excite it with typically a short noise burst, but we can excite a resonator in other ways, and we'll demonstrate that as well. And so you can make sounds like the following. Let's just go through a few little examples. Let's see, that's very dissonant, but that is using a physical modeling kind of technique, and I really want to be here, Physical Model Explorer. So we can make tune percussion types of things, okay? Let's see, what else can we do? There's a slightly different variation on that. And you note that these respond in kind of interesting ways to velocity, and that's part of physical modeling synthesis as well. The exciter doesn't have to be just a noise burst. It can be more sustained. So that maybe sounds like a bowed bell or a scraped bell. Here's a very pure bell-like tone, right? So let's set up a patch that will let us create and explore sounds like this, okay? Let's see here. All right, so let's get started making a patch where we can explore this type of synthesis. So I'm going to first load my init patch. And of course I went to the wrong location, load init preset. Now, you'll recall from my first video, there'll be a link somewhere about Myth. There aren't many, or any at all really, default routing set up in Myth. It's completely modular in that sense. And so we're going to need to set up a few things here. First, these kind of patches are going to have an exciter and a resonator, and we need to be able to control the exciter separately from the other parts of our patch. So we're going to consider our main volume ADSR to be actually just like a gate for the entire voice. And I'm going to set it up like this with a immediate attack, full sustain, and then a long release. And literally like really long, like several seconds, because what we want to do to get started is we want to hear a resonator ring out, and we want to understand the effects that the exciter is having on the resonator. So I'm just going to make this a really long release time, right? And then we're going to now create an exciter. And there's a couple different ways to do this. Typically in the literature about physical modeling, the exciter is described as a short, like white noise burst. It doesn't have to be white noise. It can actually be anything, but let's start with that traditional approach. I could build one using the wave generator, right? So under generation, we've got this module called wave. It does have a noise source, so you can set it to noise. And now we're gonna get 7 seconds of noise, okay? But there's a white noise source you could use. We're also hearing that mixed with the default iris. We will come back to this guy. We're not gonna use him right now. Let's load something into the iris to start creating our exciter. And I thought it might be interesting to either use a noise wave source or maybe a physical modeling sound itself. Where's Enigma? Where are my Enigma patches here? Enigma. There we go. So these are sounds that I actually created by running noise of various types through a resonator. Now, not in Myth, but this was using an Eventide H9, which has a really cool tunable resonator. I like this sound, would be a good one to start, so we'll just drag it into the iris. Of course, I could also right-click on the iris, and this will get us resynthesizing, quote-unquote. Resynthesize. And that's kind of a pretty iris, isn't it? So you can hear it's got this kind of resonant tone. Doesn't really matter what this... I kind of like it there. Let's set it somewhere around here. And now it's just going to continue to ring out, right? We don't want that. So we're going to add an ADSR, and this ADSR is going to be our exciter envelope. I wish you could change the names on things. You can't do that. While you can save sub patches in Myth, and we'll use that, you can't rename your things. And so if you get like a lot of modulations going, it's like, well, what the hell is ADSR 1 versus ADSR 10, right? Anyway, so our exciter, we're going to have a very short decay that will go to 0. And literally, like around the 10 millisecond range, doesn't really matter what it is. We'll do 18 milliseconds there, and we'll set our release similarly. And in a moment, oops, these are fiddly. I wish you could just type in the numbers, right? That would be kind of nice. Okay. Now, we've got a short envelope. And over in the iris, this is the gain control. So you see I could manually change the volume of the iris. It's ringing out right now, right? Because we've got that long release time on our ADSR. And now what I want to do is I want to control the volume of the iris using this envelope, right? So what I do is I just select the volume control, and then I can go over to this ADSR and push that up. And now, there we go. It's starting to sound like an exciter. At this point, let's add more noise to it. So we'll use the dirt and noise transformer. Okay, now it's mostly completely noisy. There's a little bit of tone left underneath it, and that's not a bad thing. Okay, that reminds me, one thing that we're going to want to do, because we have this very long release envelope, I'm going to go into no head mode for a second. Down here in the lower right corner, you can set the polyphony, and the init patch is set to a very generous polyphony of 24. We're going to set this down to like 12 or 8, depending on your system, so that we'll just let voice stealing take care of the sounds, the voices that are going below, a certain volume, right? This will just help us from going over on our CPU. The other thing we want to do is we want to turn on our limiter, because we're going to be dealing with resonances and self-resonating things, and actually kind of chaotic and nonlinear things that at times can make extremely loud sounds. So we want to protect our monitors and protect our ears and keep from scaring the bejesus out of ourselves by turning on our limiter. Okay, so now I'll bring my head back. Okay, so with those changes out of the way, now we've got our little noise source, okay? And then all I need to do is have something that we can excite. I need a resonator, right? There are several modules in Dawesome Myth that are designed for this kind of synthesis. So there's a comb filter, and the comb filter is a little bit wacky. There we go. It has two modes. So it's got a classic mode and this physis mode, which is a lot more resonant. So comb filter is basically just a digital delay and with a feedback loop in it. And what this causes is comb filtering, which is just a slight offset between the original sound and the delayed sound, and then the delayed or forwarded sound is fed back, and then we have damping and inharmonic controls and things like this. This specific sound here that sounds sort of like a plucked string, and it sounds different with the feedback or feed forward settings. It's in this particular implementation of the comb filter, it's not exactly like it doesn't sound so much like a string as just, you know, a lot of different arbitrary kind of resonant objects. Nothing in particular, but this is sometimes called Karplus Strong because two folks by the name of Karplus and Strong in 1983 had discovered this, that you could make an approximation of an excited string using a comb filter. And so this became known as Karplus Strong. Now, the comb filter is not as interesting as the other modules and not as useful as the other modules. So we're gonna, that's maybe it for the comb filter, but that's one thing you can do with it. We're gonna use Modal. So Modal is a module that is a bank of resonant bandpass filters. And according to the documentation, there are 32 of them, which is actually enough to model just about any static waveform. And it has an interesting property. We're listening to just the default setting, which is trained for quote unquote overtones. I don't think the original sample for this is included. So I don't know exactly what it is, but it sounds like it's just harmonic overtones, which is pretty cool. And you'll note, it already sounds like we're plucking a string, really. It's sort of like a koto, right? And we can control the amount of time that these filters ring out by adjusting the resonance control over here. We can go from very short, or we can go to like quite long. And depending on your exciter and how you have the modal unit trained by dragging or dropping or importing a sample into it, you're going to get different effects. Now, there are several factory samples that are included with Myth. And you'll see that if I select something like, there's a marimba, if I select something like a marimba, well, this actually sounds very, very much like a marimba. Marimbas actually decay much shorter. Okay, we're done. We're done. That's physical modeling. No, we're not actually done. But this is fun and easy, right? So, you know, we can use almost any sample here. And after we do a few more modifications, like we'll talk about different kinds of material that work really well in here. Spoiler alert, single cycle waveforms and even wavetables actually work well with this. And they work better than in the iris. You know, I was pretty unhappy with a lot of what we get out of the iris. But this is really fun to explore because almost anything you put into it will, if it's not, it may not be incredibly musically useful and it may be dissonant, but it will be interesting and different. Whereas I find a lot of the sounds that the iris makes samey. This is kind of ironic because the iris is at its heart basically this same thing. And we'll get there. We'll get there. So you might have noted that we don't have any velocity modulation on the amp here, so we're missing a huge part of physical modeling synthesis. What we want to do is as we strike harder, right? We want to strike the resonator harder. And so what I'm going to do is I'll just turn the amount on our exciter envelope down all the way, and then I'll just push velocity modulation all the way up. And so now I can play soft or hard. And we get nice variation with that velocity, right? And it sounds very realistic. We can make things. I'm going to load a different waveform in here. Let's do, I like this one. Note, you can, once you've got something inside the modal unit, and so this is trained on an AI-created waveform that came out of my variational autoencoders, and it just happens to have this kind of really cool, it's like a xylophone kind of sound. So, you know, it's slightly inharmonic. It's very metallic sounding. It's cool. And so let's do like maybe some other modifications here to our exciter. You note that, see how it can really be different depending upon the amount of noise in the exciter? Let's turn off modal. So we go for this little pop, 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 up to noisy, noisy, noisy. Let's modulate that a bit. Let's back our noise off a bit, and then we'll modulate it up quite a bit with velocity. And now, we're getting something that has like a lot of natural variation as we use different velocity amounts. And you can go hog wild with this. The other transformers will make the beater do different things, the exciter do different things, like if we make it more inharmonic. It just makes very subtle changes, right, to what we're getting out of the resonator. We can also use like the spectral balance control. I kind of like this from going here, kind of back to the center point. So maybe with velocity, we'll modulate that so it goes back. There we go. Okay, very cool, right? Now let's take a look at some of the different effects that we can get by changing how the modal module is tuned. I should say it's tuned in two senses. So one, it does track the pitch of the keyboard, although we can change that if we want to. Like we can pitch shift. You'll find that some settings you might want to go up an octave or two, or down an octave or two, or we could just, you know, offset it by some pitch amount. Okay, and so this is nice that it tracks the keyboard, because then we don't have to set that up. We don't have to worry about that. But then it's also tuned by loading a sample. And I think what happens with the sample is probably takes an FFT of it to extract the most important harmonics. And then the 32 resonators are set to those frequencies. And so you get very different effects depending upon the type of material that's loaded into it. So if we click in the little sample slot down here, we can either select one of the preset waves, or we can choose our own. And let's go get a single cycle waveform. If you have KRC Mathwaves, for example, you'll have a collection of about more than 25,000 single cycle waveforms. And let's go grab one of the polygonal waveforms that I haven't yet loaded. I don't think I've done like 13 sides for it. Let's try a 15-sided polygonal waveform, offset 0. Let's see. And then I want the one with the maximum number of harmonics, which is 18 harmonics. Okay, what does this guy sound like? So the effect here sounds very much like if we were to play this sample in a single cycle oscillator or in a wavetable. But we've got, you know, this nice effect that it sustains more with velocity. The timbre changes a little bit with velocity, you know, because of that exciter. Note that we're not playing the sample back. And in fact, the sample isn't part of the patch. It's just the spectral information from the sample that is now part of our patch. So that's single cycle waveform. You can get lots of different effects from this. Let's see if we can, not everything is going to be, super great. Some things are better than others. Let's just grab one of these spectral gate random phase waveforms and see what that sounds like. Oh, interesting. It's kind of like a dissonant, so it's like a string inside of a clay pot or something, yeah? Now, you might have noticed that sometimes different settings will be significantly lower or higher in volume, and so the gain module is a friend of ours here when we're doing this kind of synthesis, and I should have probably done this already. We'll put a gain module here, because this sounds a little bit soft to me. I'm going to increase the gain, right, which is increasing the loudness of our exciter, right? And then, there we go. It's these kind of sounds are like kind of exotic, and so it does sort of lead you to Orientalist impulses, right? We'll try not to play too many pentatonic scales and stuff. Now, this particular sound is sort of inharmonic, right? So I can use this redux control it's not really filtering, but what we're doing is we're removing the kind of less important harmonics, the less strong harmonics. And so this can be an interesting effect. The other thing we can do is this is good for velocity modulation, right? We can have an instrument that it's very calm, if we play lightly, but then we'll like modulate the redux with velocity so that with higher velocities, it comes back to being the full set of tunings. And that can be an interesting effect. And there we go. I don't know why did my drag not work? And probably because I'm not paying attention. So that's another interesting kind of, physical modulation that we can do. Let's set that back and remove the modulation for now. So single cycle waveforms can be super interesting. Another thing you can do, and this doesn't work so well in the iris itself, is we can actually grab a wavetable. And depending upon what's in our wavetable, we'll kind of get a kind of like an average of all the spectral information in the wavetable. And so some types of wavetables will work very well. Let's see. I want to go somewhere else. Let's go grab a wavetable. Here are a bunch of wavetable collections that are part of KRC Mathwaves. What would be interesting here? We can try some of these convolution wavetables. Perhaps. I think these will be pretty dissonant. I'll just grab one. Now, a wavetable is just it's a wave file, basically, that's a collection of single cycle waveforms. So it's like just a short bit of audio. But Modal can process that. So that's very different, right? So here it's got like a lot of lows and then a lot of highs in it. That's kind of interesting. Grab another one of these guys at random and just see what happens. Huh. Interesting, right? We could maybe build a bass out of that or something. Anyway, there's a lot to explore there. I'm trying not to go down a rat hole of demoing too much of this kind of stuff. We could load it with like a noise source if we wanted to. Let's do, what are these? This might be interesting. What is a very low Blade Runner-y kick sound like? Now, another interesting thing is if you if the sample that you load has chordal properties. Oh, I haven't tried this yet. Would vinyl crackles do anything? Maybe. Yeah, they do. Very dissonant. Now, if the sample that we load has chordal properties, let's take a look at what's inside here. That might be interesting. Let's go back over here and adjust our gain down. So that's interesting, right? You can hear the chordal stuff a little bit. And actually, if we go to like something with like a electric piano sample, this one might be interesting. Yeah. You can hear that really strong chordal effect. Okay. So you can see you can have a lot of fun with that. And note that we don't have to just, do an extremely short pulse. We can make it longer. Or we could change the attack, and this will be a very different effect. Okay? All sorts of fun we can have there. Let's go back to just a few milliseconds. Okay, I feel like I'm being really boring today, and I apologize for that. Now, let's just get this back to maybe one of our polygonal waveforms. And you see again, we need to turn our gain back down. Oops. It's kind of easy to accidentally move the module rather than move its controls. Now the exciter doesn't have to be just a single hit. We could, model things like flams or rolls as well, right? So if instead of just this short tick, I wanted a repeating tick, one thing I could do is I could remove this ADSR from our iris velocity, and let's get us an LFO instead. And we want a ramp. So let's load a ramp into it. I'm going to adjust it to go the other way. And instead of modulating iris volume with the ASR, we will modulate it with this LFO. And you'll see it's just going to now like repeat and repeat and repeat, right? So let's add an amount modifier to this, okay? And then we will modulate the amount by this ADSR, which we're going to adjust. So let's see, we will increase that. It's too short, right? There we go. And now let's change the shape a little bit, and we'll greatly increase its speed, something like a quarter dot. And then let's modulate the speed up with our ADSR. That's kind of neat. So, fun little modulation ideas you can do there. I feel like I'm a little low energy today, and I am excited about this type of synthesis, and I don't know. Some days you're feeling it, some days you're not. Now, so far, these sounds have been kind of mallet-y, I guess. Let's remove that. Let's go back to do 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 do. We're adjusting our envelope to be a short tick, not that long. Shorter tick, please. That's fine. And then we'll go back to modulating our amp. There we go. These have all been, you know, kind of bell-like. We can get more stringy things depending on what's loaded into it. Let's look at... That's very string-like. Okay. We looked at using an iris, right, as an exciter. Let's try using the generator as our exciter. So I'll turn off the iris. I'm going to keep that gain control around. Let's add a wave here, and we'll set it to noise. Okay. Now, to give us we're going to use this gain now like a VCA, and so we're going to modulate the gain parameter with our exciter envelope. There we go. And you can see that has a slightly different sound. And again, we might want to add another gain here because this is a little low in volume. We're not quite hitting the modal resonator hard enough. And you can drive this into distortion. And so let's listen to what our exciter sounds like now. You know, it's just noise. So that's another way that you can build an exciter. When you have string-like sounds, sometimes it's interesting after them to do a little saturation or something. I mean, now we're just... maybe modulate the saturation with velocity. That's pretty interesting. And at this point, maybe we'd want to add some effects. But let's look at another use case for a modal resonator. And I'm going to we could put this in the filter section, but I'm just going to build it here in the OS. Let's go get Modal's counterpart, resonator. And for whatever reason, resonator is under effect and not under filter. I guess there's kind of a reason for that. When we do this, feedback. When we do this kind of effect, now resonator is very similar to modal. It's the same 32-band filter bank, but instead of the redux parameter, we've got a tracking parameter, and it's set by default not to track the keyboard. So this is to simulate like taking our existing sound and putting it in some resonant space. And so just as I loaded a sample into modal, you can load samples into RESO. And there's actually a bunch of interesting samples that come with Myth that are resonant bodies. And if you listen to these samples by themselves, that's kind of pretty. If you listen to these samples by themselves, they're like noise bursts that are run through some sort of physical object, maybe an instrument body or something like that. And if I turn a mount all the way up, we'll be hearing the completely wet signal. It's kind of nice to allow some of the original signal, back in, right? So not to have this full wet. And we could maybe change how long it rings out again with the RESO. Or we could even get different effects if we change adjust the inharmonicity. It's very pleasant right here, though. Cool, right? Another way that you can use modal and or RESO is in your effects loop. So let's add resonator there. And let's load it with, there we go. I've got one preset saved for RESO, and it's a chordal hit. And so now anything that's coming into the effects mix here is going to take on kind of a chordal property. And it might be interesting to, hit that with the grains effect and maybe make it fully wet. Oh yeah. Turn up glitter. It's a little too wet. I want to get more of my original signal back. And now we're back in Hearts of Space territory. So that's another way that you can use these. And again, like, experimentation is really fun and interesting. You can get all sorts of cool effects. Let's look at something. I'm going to turn the effects off. We'll go back to our oscillator. Turn this guy off as well. Now that we have the wave module hitting our resonator, there's this modal over here that has this format saw wavetable loaded into it. Where do I want to be? Maybe about here. Let's listen to the effect of having a sustained exciter. So that's sustained white noise hitting our resonator, and that's pretty cool. Now, a modal filter can process, as we've already seen, like actually any sort of signal. So we don't have to limit ourselves to noise. We could use some of the other waveforms that the VA wave generator can do. And let's listen to the saw. Whoa. It's a case where we need to turn our gain down. Now, do you feel like you've heard this kind of sound before? Especially if it's up here? This is the sound of the iris, right? This is the type of sound that the iris makes. And as soon as I did this, I was like, okay, this is how the iris works. The iris at its heart is probably this exact modal filter, this 32, this bank of 32 resonators. But the difference in the iris is that it's changing over time, right? So there's this AI processing, machine learning processing that's being done, and essentially creating keyframes for the iris to move between, and those different keyframes are different settings for a modal filter. And so that this is kind of is squarify, just like making the exciter, the sustained exciter, squarish? Maybe so. I think so. So the different transformers, I think, are modifying not just the modal bank and the spectral response of it, but are probably changing the exciter as well. And I suspect, you see, if I turn this up, I can get pretty unpleasant effects. resonance in the iris is probably much lower than it can go in the modal unit itself. But this I thought was an interesting discovery. Now, this kind of leads us to another sort of limitation, I think, of the iris, and a way that it could be improved. You can see that, like, noise and different waveforms give us very different effects. And if we mix them together, that's interesting. So let me get rid of this guy. And let's put another wave generator in. And, we could do like a mix of white noise and the square wave for a different effect. Now you see, this kind of gets us more into like a wind instrument territory. And so we could change the mix of the two waveforms over time. So we've got this square wave and the noise. Let's add another ADSR here, and let's just make a simple decay. I don't know, quarter second or so. Like a quarter second might be good. And we will use that. Oops, I turned off my oscillator. Let's use that to modulate mix. So we will set the white noise mix down, and we'll modulate its volume up. There we go. So there's kind of a blowing effect now. And then let's go do square the other way. We'll modulate its mix. Click the mix parameter key, modulate it back. That needs a little bit more work, but you can see that it would be interesting, not to go back to this thing should play samples thing, but this thing should play samples. A pure sample could be interesting as an exciter, and I wish the iris had that. I wish we had more control over it. Let's see. Let's save our work. Versionize that. There's other patches where I did this where I think I was more patient, and I was more let's see, where is it? Oh, it's under how the iris works. How the iris works. It's one of these. Yeah, there we go. So that's like a really cool. Call me Zamfir because I'm the master of the pan flute. That's a great little physical model, right? Of some kind of flute-like instrument. Again, using the same concept that I was just demonstrating and sort of lazily patching before. I think that's really cool. And so this is a fun way to play around with the same thing that the iris is doing, but I think we get more interesting and controllable effects, if you ask me, and I think they sound better. I think my ears and preferences are just really different from Peter's, and I suspect in the iris, his sustained exciter is like much more aggressive than I would be with it. I think it overdrives, and it just leads to a lot of kind of extra noisy stuff that I don't like. Maybe other people like it. And so once you have a patch like this set up, you can experiment, right, with different settings for modal, load it with different samples, and I think I did a couple of things like that. Yeah. I think that's kind of neat and spooky. It's just a very interesting sound. I wonder what happens if we randomly choose some other wavetable. Let's go to, well, the format saw the wavetables, the format wavetables work pretty well. Let's go to maybe format squares. I did a whole video on these wavetables. You can watch it in my channel, my Mathwaves channel playlist. That's pretty interesting. All right, well, there's a little overview of physical modeling. I think I did a segment with the comb. I'm doing this in pieces today, so there's going to be some editing involved. But I think we talked about the comb filter. It's not as interesting and powerful as the modal and RESO modules. Anyway, have some fun. I will probably create some packs of settings for modal and RESO, and some interesting base patches that might be like a very cheap paid thing that you might find at wavetables.lol soon, because I think this is interesting. Again, you have to be in the mood for it. But you can do a lot of really fun stuff. I hope you learned something today. Happy synthesizing, and I will talk to you later.